topic of Girinandini Singh is listening affects, evocations on silence as a mode of decolonial thinking / being / doing / theorizing. And we'll hear that now. So the floor or the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. And it's such an honor to be part of this panel. It's incredible. I'll get started really quickly. I look at listening as a methodology of a research inquiry, but also as a process of achieving decoloniality in higher education classrooms. And some of the methods that I use is around poetry and storytelling as decolonial sites of knowledge making. So I'm just going to get started. I know, I think, as I write, I create, I speak myself into being. When I begin to perform a poem, standing in front of the classroom, I picture my body spreading itself outward, like wings drawn out, bringing you, the other, the audience, the separate, into the fold of an...
Maybe you could speak a bit louder?
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Right. When I begin to perform a poem, standing in front of the classroom, I picture my body spreading itself outward, like wings drawn out, bringing you, the other, the audience, the separate, into the fold of an internal world. An invitation, perhaps, or an act of vulnerability, or is it, instead, an experiencing whilst the experience of a collectivity, co-theorizing, collaborating, co-storytelling? I call them research poems, and through, with, / in them, I question myself, often wondering how internal is this world that I built, will build. Marked up by externalities, as I stand in front of the room, poised to let my sound carry my voice, my words, my poems, then again I am a face on your screen. A series of ones and zeros come together as a moving picture, delivering raw insights turned out. I am simply a voice traveling through wireless headphones, a story punctuated by pauses, inflections, a moving cadence, silence, short breaths, your breaths, my poem, our bodies moved. I attend to the use of sound itself as an act / action of, that is, behavior and direction, as a site of creating, building and disseminating knowledge, of knowing, being, doing things differently, where sound and listening are used as methodologies of decolonial knowing, doing, and thinking. Sound / soundlessness, namely the epistemic violence of silence, is considered here as a means of interrogating tension in the race and gendered classrooms, questioning the idea of safe spaces, what these are, if they exist, and how they are sustained. Where do I begin? The assemblage that is I. As I sat down to write this article, fleshing out a research inquiry that was meant to occupy me for the next 3 years of my academic career, because I'm a first-year PhD, I was pulled into its Russian doll-esque internality that is breached and marked by the external. It is the intra-relating that Barad speaks of. I began from a place of curiosity, what it meant to explore sound and silence as a form of presencing alternative underlying sociocultural worlds, histories, legacies, and futures within the higher education classroom that are affected and that affect the interlaced and intersectional identities that learners bring. Struck by this impact of the word I and the question of power and positionality within that I, it helped in developing the nature of this inquiry. I, the researcher, I, the poet, the outsider within the academy, as an artist researcher, the student of color, the foreigner, the privileged being part of the University of Cambridge, as well as the minority being a citizen of India. These were just a few eyes that occupied me. So the unraveling of these intersecting identities were the starting point, the unpacking of the identity-ridden, intersectionally complex and nuanced pockets of pluralistic existence that I was going in to interrogate. The time spaces which hold these pockets act as points of tension, reflecting on what the act/action of decolonizing learning environments shows up as, while also holding the opportunity to diffract through them. The idea of diffraction means reading through each other in a relational way, as a way of doing ontoepistemology differently. Moving from decoloniality from a philosophical discussion to an actual embodied act, what that means. So the attempt of this project is to produce a product of decolonial practice, but it is also to exercise a way of decolonial thinking, which now more than ever requires us to move beyond the philosophical discussion or lip service without its actual embodied praxis, which is what Istrati and him are speaking of here in this quote. So how would questioning or reversing these underlying structural and normative factors of our existing monolithic view of knowledge show up as in practice? This is something that Thiongo has also touched upon when he talks about the mental universe of the colonized, even years after they have attained their freedom. And he talks about how the economic and political control can never be complete or effective without the actual mental control. And to control people's culture is a way of controlling their tools of self-definition in relationship to others. And these are things that impact learner identities when they come into higher education learning environments, where the environment is extremely globalized and diversified. Using arts-based education research, which is what I use as an artist, a spoken word artist, as well as a writer. This is the methodologies that I turn to in my research inquiry. Embarking on my PhD research project in an early conversation with my supervisor, I remember saying that I am practice first. I am art first. Art is my research. It is my critical lens. And I feel that it is the criticality, this criticality is often undermined. What I'm attempting to describe was a creative practice that held a critical lens within it. It created a byproduct that was art, but the artwork itself was critically fraught with nodes of tension, interrogation, theory, and epistemics, which are perhaps done differently but are no less intensive. Simon O'Sullivan speaks to this when he writes about ethical aesthetics, which is best understood as a kind of paradigm outside the more scientific and narrowly technological ways and related to the practice of self-creation. And it is the same thing that Finley speaks about when she talks about craft as a means of opening liminal spaces for the discovery of what is not yet in an improved world. These are spaces of transformation and emergent thinking. So this practice as research process of building educational research approach treats the practice itself as a primary site of data collection, where the practice itself becomes the primary evidence of research. Using sound, storytelling, and poetry. Exploring arts as a critical methodology and a place to build/create knowledge from, that is building theory, looks at decoloniality and the reverberating affects of sound/soundlessness, storytelling and poetry as ways of knowing, being, and learning. Allowing myself to center my research around such an idea started to feel really novel, yet it wasn't new, as you can see from this quote that Barbara Christian observed in 1987. I use the word allow here in line with what Linda Tuhiwai-Smith says, talking about how imperialism continues to have its lasting impact on people who have experienced its violence, writing that it still destroys and it reforms itself constantly. She goes on to say that indigenous people and people of minorities and marginal cultures that were often impressed upon as an international group have had to challenge, understand, and have a shared knowledge and language to talk about these things. It begins with an allowance to be able to talk about what was lost, and perhaps it is continually lost. On the usage of sound, I remember the rat-a-tat-tat clinking of cans that trailed the cart of the kabariwala, the recycling man, as he wheeled his gems, shiny curiosities in his mobile treasury. We hear him a block away as he makes his rounds around the blocks of flats of our suburbia. A, B, C, D. Hear the clinking of cans a mile away, inching closer. Impatient, we run towards him, a horde of children, our shoes hitting the pavement, pitter-patter, pitter-patter. Pulled to the music of the cart, he lets us examine one by one the discarded pieces of lives. Histories, trinkets, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. I hear in the recesses of my mind each time I sit down to write, unpacking my own assimilation myth, searching deep within for the long discarded, historied trinkets of my life, knowingly, unknowingly, buying into the dream, as Villanueva writes, only to realize that assimilation just can't happen. The close link between sound and affect is perhaps best drawn out from our memory banks. For instance, the sound of the Tin Man instantly pulls me back to a memory of childhood adventure, the nostalgia washing over my body, bringing an affective response of weightlessness and childlike curiosity. Writing about the affects of sound or affective scratchings, we understand that sound is somewhat swift and imperceptible. Other times, bodies cannot help but feel these points where time stands still. It draws you back, it leaps ahead, and you slip into the breaks. Sound extends into bodies, and bodies extend into sound. These sonorous flickers, gut punches, or complex mobilities reveal crevices and fissures that launch new worlds and open us up to multiple possibilities. Frawley, too, writing about the nature of the sound, speaks of how it's constantly moving. It is open-ended, but it can be felt and detected. The idea of affective scratching builds on Wahili's concept of the grooves as social historical forces that engage and bring people together in magical ways. New ways of knowing, being, engaging, and perhaps even entangling with one another. Dernico's comments on this when she says what grooves do, and writes that they enable us to exceed what is in order to produce slippages, allurements, intensities, and newness. So practicing onto epistemology differently. Thus, what such affective scratchings helps us to understand is not what affect in conjunction with sound does, but what it is by nature. In the context of the pluralistic classroom or learning environment, affective sound works with tension, acting as the diffractive apparatus that allows us to better sense the resonances of whiteness in our existing monolithic worldview. As we do so, we equip ourselves to go deeper or to listen for the stagnant, presencing the non-white frequencies of the flesh. The very act of listening becomes an activating force. Listening affects what is sounding, and it creates a symbiotic relationship. Listening affects. In the Arts Creativity Research Group seminar that was held in November 2022, I performed for the first time the poem Dreaming of Snow in Revolt. It was a performance that was deeply personal to my own experience of moving, living, learning, and building knowledge in varied cultural contexts. Until recently, I refused to claim myself as a poet, this hesitation stemming from the idea of an official school poetry that Joseph T. Thomas Jr. writes about as a form that is given dominance because of its institutional backing, the kind of poetry that is written by adults and taught to children in the classroom, wherein they are encouraged to tear the poem apart, act on it as a detached autopsy. This is, as Thomas Jr. writes, different from the poetry of the playground, building its own aesthetic world in play, imagination, and affect, one that doesn't follow the formal structures of official poetry with iambic pentameters and mathematical perfection and metaphor, yet it is poetry nonetheless. Theory, too, and perhaps an act of resilience. It is, as Audre Lorde writes, an attempt to write yourself into existence, sing your body into becoming, your words, your voice, move past what those have claimed, rely not solely upon your ideas to liberate, but dig deep into that dark, ancient space, the incredible reserve. At the end of the performance, as we began a discussion of sound and the movement of sound during the performance, an MPhil student researcher of color sitting in the audience spoke up. Before this, she said, I would never believe this was poetry, yet the performance moved me, through me. I didn't understand it all the time, but I felt it. It was doing something within me. I felt it in the goosebumps on my arms, So much of what you say is what I have felt, and yet we are not the same. I didn't know this could be poetry, and I didn't know that I was moving poetry. So the provocations that arose from that sessions was some of the things that I'm occupied with in my research project. What emergences can the affect of sound lead to? How can these be heard? How can these be worked through? And how can these be understood to build pluralistic spaces of being and to actually bring decolonial work into the classroom in action beyond a philosophical discussion of it? How sound acts/works is understood here through Haraway's post-humanist idea of tentacular thinking, which she explains as follows. Tentacles come from the Latin tentaculum, meaning fila, and tantare, meaning to feel and to try. A tentacled mode of learning, knowing, being, engaging means one can move through the tension, resistance, and release of multiple sensory worlds, sociocultural worlds, and affective worlds. Listening. Pauline Oliveros, in her book, Quantum Listening, talks about the practice of deep listening, where experience comes first before anything else. In doing so, we emphasize both the details of sound and the scope of sound. And I would like to extend this further to include the scope of the act of listening. Most acutely experienced in mindful practices, where the sound is heard, include that of daily life, nature, and our own thoughts. To understand quantum listening or deep listening and who the quantum listener is, there are a few provocations put forth. When do you stop hearing sound? When does sound simply exist and seep into your consciousness? And where does memory begin? When I approach the act of listening, it is as an active agent to the other agential act of silencing. I would say, in that sense, it is a form of presencing. The performance in the ACRG seminar was an act of collaborative listening where the listening field activated varied environments, the noises and voices of the environment, chatter outside the room, the hushed silence within the room, the words of the poem, the memories triggered by the words. These associations that came from personal memory banks, but were also a collaborative act of memory making. And the act of listening was seen through our own social cultural lenses, what is innate and what is learned. So as much as listening can act as an agent of silencing, we choose what we let in. And when we listen, making those agential cuts, it can also do the contrary, which is hold a space that presences alternative narratives, stories, sounds, and experience. So in conclusion, I would say that affective expectations found on the work done by Deleuze and Guattari, who moved affect into the realm of education, thus having trouble the current era of standards and accountability, largely marked by techno-rational approaches to education. This also brings us to the idea of thinking in assemblages. Affect is not what you feel as much as it is an event that forces you to become affective, to feel something. The body then becomes dynamic and interactive, as Barad says. It is constantly being affected or remodeled by events, ideas, experiences, etc., occurring outside and inside of it in a state of continual configuration and reconfiguration by both human and non-human elements. I'm proposing to explore and look at future provocation towards decolonial being, learning, thinking, and theorizing that come from and that can be achieved within this continual state of configuration and reconfiguration, that are akin to the liminal spaces that Finley spoke of earlier, coming off of art-based research methods. Using craft as a means of opening spaces for the discovery of what is not yet in an improved world. Thank you so much. Here are just a few references if anyone's interested in further reading. Yeah, thank you.